It's July 24th, 1911, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
When the Incas died out in the 16th century, so did any widespread knowledge of the location of the winter retreat enjoyed by their elite. Peruvian peasants, however, knew all along. So today in history in 1911, when the American professor Hiram Bingham supposedly discovered the lost city of Machu Picchu, he was actually being shown the way by a local 11-year-old.
Yeah, Bingham had been climbing for hours, often on his hands and knees. He was sweaty and tired. But when he saw Machu Picchu, he described having a sudden surge of energy. What he saw, he later wrote, was, quote, an unexpected sight, a great flight of beautifully constructed stone terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. Suddenly I found myself confronted with the walls of ruined houses built of the finest quality of Inca stonework. The ruins, he said, were overgrown by trees and bamboo thickets and tangles of vines and covered with moss. But the white walls behind them, he said, again, quote, were carefully cut and exquisitely fitted together, and the scene fairly took my breath away.
But Bingham didn't know what he was looking at. He thought he was looking at Vilcabamba, the famous lost Inca capital. It was the final stronghold of Inca civilization during the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. And looking at, this literal magnificent city in the sky, of course you would assume that's what it was. And Bingham would actually inadvertently discover it later. It was just, some bits of stone in the middle of this deep jungle, and he'd already seen Machu Picchu and been wowed by that. Because Vilcabamba being the last capital, this is where the Inca Empire died. It was on its last legs, whereas Machu Picchu had been built at the height of its glory days.
Yeah, so what was Machu Picchu? I mean, I said in my intro that it was the winter retreat enjoyed by the Inca elite, because basically that's the theory that I buy the most. But there are other things that it could be. It certainly had some kind of religious significance because it aligns with various astronomical phenomena, the position of the sun, etc. But we don't know for sure because the Incas died without leaving behind any writings. They didn't have a written language. So all we know is it's the famous city in the clouds. It is 2,430 metres above sea level, 450 metres above the river. So it's an amazing thing to build up there, only from stone and bronze tools. I mean, bear in mind, they had no wheels. They had to cut all the stones and fit them in without mortar. So, the fact that these bricks are still there is in itself remarkable. It turns out that the location is between two fault lines. So these buildings have withstood earthquakes. Because the different slabs are so perfectly cut and fit without mortar that they stay together. All Bingham knew was that this was obviously a very significant site. He just didn't understand what. And I suppose as much as I discredited his position as the discoverer, I suppose he was the first Westerner to fully understand its significance, even though actually Europeans had seen it before.
Yeah, and it was partially a fluke that he had found it in the first place, as we say, because, explorers had been roaming the Peruvian countryside for years, searching for the legendary lost city of the Incas, which they imagined was filled with gold. That's kind of why they were going after it. But it was Bingham's skill in being, just the first person in the region to gather up as much oral testimony as he possibly could. He really spoke to people, asked them what they knew, the people who lived in the regions he was exploring. He also used the names and places mentioned in the Spanish chronicles and maps of past Peruvian geographers, and then went from location to location just looking at things. And also, he was gifted in this one particular quality he had, which was that he never turned down any offer to go look for ruins. So anything that anyone told him along the way, he was like, yep, I'll give that a look. I mean, his own background is quite interesting. He was born in Honolulu. He was the son of two Protestant missionaries, and from a really young age, he found solace in books and got very into Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And he was sort of he became hailed as this kind of proto-Indiana Jones, a quasi-archaeologist, even though he wasn't an archaeologist turned adventurer, who felt more at home actually in the middle of the jungle than buried in a textbook. But he almost didn't get to the jungle full stop, because even though he had developed this passion for Latin American history as a young boy, Once he got his PhD, he went to Yale University and was pursuing this career as a lecturer, and that might have been all that he ever was had he not met and married Alfreda Mitchell, who was an heiress to the Tiffany jewellery fortune, and now he had enough funds behind him, he was able to fulfill his dreams, which were to embark on these major expeditions to South America.
Yeah, Latin American history at the time was a very understudied subject in North America. In fact, Bingham actually had to borrow a PhD advisor from Yale while he was doing his PhD at Harvard because they didn't have anyone who was capable of supervising him. And so expeditions to South America weren't just, a box-ticking exercise by a student. They were necessary. They were advancing the research. A lot of stuff just wasn't known. And in 1908, when he was lecturing at Yale, he attended a conference in Chile, and on his way home, he visited Peru to see some Inca ruins, and that inspired him to organise his own expedition, this one, the 1911 Yale Peruvian expedition. Bingham was now 36. He was a dashing young professor. He went with 6 other academics. They landed in Peru in June, and they started exploring the Urubamba River Valley, which was the expected location of the lost city. There was a slightly, you mentioned people had actually already been to Machu Picchu, and there was a slightly pesky problem. As he explored the ruin, Bingham found not just remarkable, those iconic farming terraces, the ruins of marvellous temples, he also found charcoal graffiti with the name of Agustin Lizarraga and the date 1902. Lizarraga was a well-off local farmer and amateur explorer who had visited the ruins while looking for new land to farm. He did tell some friends, including a few academics, but it didn't make the news, it didn't go international, and he died about 6 months after this day, after falling in a river. And so the road that takes tourist buses to Machu Picchu now is the Hiram Bingham III highway, not the Agustin Lizarraga highway.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, Bingham did put the work in. As you said earlier, he was scrambling on his hands and knees at one point to reach the top of this. One of his Peruvian employees had drowned in front of him carrying his belongings across the river, and he carried on. So, I mean, he had determination against what was obviously a pretty dangerous route, even if he was getting assistance from locals. On the Indiana Jones thing, I was reading all of this and I was imagining Harrison Ford in the khakis with the white shirt and everything. And so I looked into that, is there a connection? Because I know that Lucas and Spielberg have always said, Indiana Jones was inspired directly by the matinees that we saw as kids. They've never said, we were inspired by the story of Hiram Bingham. I've never heard that. But clearly, this academic that was married into New York wealth and then, had this kind of glamorous look and then went and found this, Machu Picchu, does feel like a pretty obvious inspiration. The costume designer for Raiders of the Lost Ark has gone on the record to say that one of the inspirations for the costume of Indiana Jones, keep up, was the Charlton Heston film Secret of the Incas, which was released in 1953 and is basically about this. He's playing Bingham in that, and he's wearing the fedora, the leather jacket, the white shirt. So even if Spielberg and Lucas weren't directly inspired by Bingham, they were inspired by the costume design of the film that was inspired by Bingham. So there is a connection.
It's an homage of an homage. Yes. You've got to dig deep with this one.
But Bingham, no Bingham, no Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's all I'm saying.
Sure, yeah. Well, Bingham himself returned to Machu Picchu many times and he took hundreds of photographs. He ended up excavating graves and transporting thousands of artifacts, including pottery and tools and bronze knives, back to the United States. That actually sparked a long-standing dispute between Yale University and the Peruvian government over the fact that they'd massively exported all of this cultural heritage. But UNESCO has declared Machu Picchu a World Heritage Site. That happened in 1983. They called it an absolute masterpiece of architecture and a unique testimony to the Inca civilization. So it's not surprising that Peru would quite like the bits and pieces that Bingham nicked off with back in this place that is also a huge tourist draw these days.
Yeah, I mean, the expedition brought back all of these exciting artifacts and animal specimens and, of course, photos. There were lots of photos taken on the expedition, but all of that in turn fueled American imaginations, and that generated the interest in Peru and the Inca culture necessary to make Machu Picchu a big deal. It's sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. People wouldn't necessarily have been that excited about Machu Picchu, although obviously it's visually very striking. people wouldn't have been interested in the significance without Bingham coming back with all of this stuff. And National Geographic, when Bingham went back in 1912 with archaeologists for a more in-depth study, National Geographic devoted a whole issue to this expedition, so further cementing it in the popular imagination as a big deal, and Bingham would go back several times, developing his theory that Machu Picchu was the lost Inca capital, which would finally be disproven in the 1960s.
Bingham took the opportunity, meantime, to turn his back on academia. He wrote a best-selling book about this. Then he went into politics, serving as a senator for Connecticut, and later helping President Truman's administration identify communists working in government.
Bingham's hobby was being an early amateur aviator, and he ultimately, this was just something he did on the side, by the way, ultimately ended up running the US military's largest flight school in France during World War I. So then when after the war, he went on to be elected, well, actually, first he was elected, this is crazy, he was elected governor of Connecticut, but only served one day because he had also been elected as a senator for Connecticut, and he decided to go with the senatorship. And he was given the extremely cool nickname, the Flying Senator.
Oh, that is cool.
Yeah, cool guy.
Unless you're a communist.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.